Hey everyone, so thank you for joining the call this afternoon. My name is Christian Stanley, and I'm a partner and senior financial advisor at Greenspring Advisors. We're based out of Towson, Maryland, and we help companies design, build, and maintain their workplace retirement plans. We currently work with over 150 plans across the country, and those plans represent around 50,000 employees and over $5 billion of retirement assets. I'll be the moderator for today's session, but the real reason you all joined today's webinar was to hear our speaker, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Thanks a lot, Christian. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Courtney Lee, and I'm an investment strategist here at Dimensional Fund Advisors. For those of you who may not have heard or may not be familiar with Dimensional, we were built over 40 years ago on the foundation of economic theory and empirical academic research. And as such, we continue to have strong ties with the academic community and follow the science in designing and implementing portfolios systematically. Our approach has worked so well that investors have entrusted us with about $575 billion in assets. So I'm looking forward to spending the time with you and giving you all a taste of what exactly that breadth of experience and implementation looks like.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Courtney. Of course, we have to walk through housekeeping. And so just a couple of items that I do want to address before we dive in. We will be offering SHRM or SHRM credits for those of you who are on the call with that designation for at least 50 minutes. This webinar will be recorded and distributed to everyone who signed up. So regardless of your attendance, you'll get a link to the recording. And then when it comes to delivering you the CE credits and the recording, we ask that you give us about a week's time to turn that around. So we ask that you look for that by next Friday. We do have a Q&A feature. I'm sure this isn't your first Zoom rodeo, but if you have any questions throughout today's conversation, we just ask that you drop it in the question box. I have it up here on my other screen. If we do not answer it as we go through, we do have a session at the end where we can circle back on the questions that were asked. And then if we do run out of time and don't have the ability to respond to your question, we'll follow up separately via email to ensure you have the resources that you need. We will be offering 3 polls throughout today's conversation. Courtney tells me it's because we want to make sure you are paying attention. But in all seriousness, we're going to launch a couple of polls just really to gauge the temperature of you all as the audience. And so we're going to do a quick practice run, although we do hope you respond to this poll around, just give me 1 second to launch here. Poll number 1. And what we're asking here is, what did you hope to achieve by joining today's webinar? Give you about 10 more seconds. It looks like the vast majority of folks here are just curious, which you've tuned into the right webinar. We're still missing 6 attendees. We won't name names, but we'll give you 10 more seconds if you don't mind letting us know what you hope to achieve today. Awesome. So we have some folks who are actively using ESG. That's great. Folks who are inquiring. This is all good stuff. Thank you all for attending. So our practice run turned out to be successful. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and launch into the program that we have today. And if you don't mind, I'm a big proponent that we're all wired for stories, so I'll share one with you. So about 5 years ago, I was introduced to a prospective client to review their 401k plan and its investments. During our conversation, it was clear that the organization hoped to have environmentally and socially conscious funds in their fund lineup. And I knew this for 2 reasons. First, the company was and still is a service provider in the environmental field. And the second reason, they told me. So I never said I was the smartest person on the call. That's why we have Courtney here. So for those of you who are my clients or work with Greenspring, sometimes you just have to tell us or tell me specifically what you want. But all jokes aside, after several conversations with this prospective client, I went to work to determine 3 things. The first was, what does ERISA, which is the law that governs all qualified plans, 401ks, 403bs, what does it have to say about environmentally and socially responsible investing? The last thing I wanted to do for this particular client or any of our clients was put them at risk from a fiduciary perspective. The second thing is once we had or we deemed that there was approval by the powers that be, i.e. ERISA, I wanted to look at the available options that were out there and how they align to this particular organization and their employees. And then the last thing I wanted to ensure was that their employees, not just the executives, care enough about these actual investments to put their dollars in them. So I started at the top. I went back to my office and I read everything that I could get my hands on about ERISA and its opinion about environmental and social investing. And what I found was these products, they're not new. They date back to the 1960s, and they're really not shy from controversy either. While ERISA doesn't explicitly say that environmental and socially driven funds are prohibited, administrations over the years have voiced their opinions loud and clear, either for or against these fund types. They've done so through published IRS bulletins or field assistance letters. So needless to say, there's competing information, and there was no wonder that investors and plan sponsors really found this topic confusing. Some of you may attribute to that here on the call today. Fortunately, though, we were able to determine that social and environmental funds were permissible in corporate retirement plans, so long as they were prudently monitored, and were not given what we would say special consideration as it compared to the other funds available for participants to select. So with that determination in place, we look to the available market for possible options. Now, unfortunately for me, this is where things got most confusing. Not more confusing, most confusing. And here's why. There's no clear definition on what environmental and social funds should look like or how they should invest, which is something we do, Courtney and myself, hope to clear up for you today. And in the absence of a specific definition, it was apparent that every investment provider created their own definition and their own approach. And it's largely still that way today. So if you're following along, we have a vague definition and seemingly infinite number of approaches. To make matters worse, I found funds masquerading as either social or green funds, when in fact they were really just sector funds looking for new ways to market themselves and attract new assets. So needless to say, I was overloaded with information and parched at the meaning. But fortunately, though, through hours of research, we were able to build a list of fund options to take back to this particular plan sponsor. And this is where things got kind of fun. So now that we had a selection and deemed a group of funds what we would call prudent, we were less concerned about providing options to employees for option's sake, but we were more focused on providing options that they actually wanted to invest in. And so we decided to run a survey to the staff. And here's what we found. Courtney, if you could advance the slide, thank you. The first question, we really wanted to help define ESG for employees, right? We're sitting at a committee level. We're the investment professional. We had a vague idea of what ESG was. And what we wanted to do was draw that sandbox for participants. And then we wanted to know, was it that important to them? Should we continue to advance our evaluation and our offering? And simply put, we found that they truly cared. As you see, over 80% of the employees responded that ESG investing, again, after we defined it, was both very and extremely extremely important to them. Next slide, Courtney. So the next question was really centered on investment philosophy from a fund perspective. So what we found is a lot of investments in the marketplace either completely negative screened or removed all companies that weren't sustainable at all, and what I deemed ESG pure, or there was funds that took approaches where they just allocated less money to the folks that weren't as sustainable over time. So we really wanted to get a grasp for what employees, given the huge investment world that's out there on ESG funds, what they really wanted. And what they were looking for. And this helped us hone down that pool that we found to be prudent investments. Now, on the next slide, we asked a question around diversification. And this really piggybacked on the previous question that we showed, where he said, okay, there's varying investment philosophies when it comes to ESG investing. We know largely that the employees were somewhat flexible in terms of going full ESG or having some funds and incorporating some funds that are trying to be more sustainable over time. And so we wanted to let them know about the potential quote unquote risk. So this is targeting diversification. So diversification, simply put, is an investment principle where, generally speaking, the more options you select over time, it reduces your volatility and can increase your investment returns. Anytime you shrink a pool of securities or investments, you can have the opportunity to reduce turns and increase volatility. So we wanted to let them know to say, hey, if we were to shrink funds or shrink the available options too much, it could impact diversification and could potentially increase risk in your portfolio. And really what we found is employees said, hey, we're willing to take the risk. So the last question is, again, there's infinite number of ways and approaches to look at these fund types. We wanted to know exactly what employees cared about as we incorporated ESG metrics into the fund. And so this was one of those select all that apply type of questions. And we found that it was really broad in what they wanted to incorporate in ESG funds. So what did we learn? The desires of the leadership aligned directly with the employees, which was great to know. We also found that employees would allocate more dollars to companies to their top groups or top peer groups, if you will, from an ESG perspective, but also didn't want to exclude people who were hoping to be more environmentally conscious over time. So companies with a plan to become more sustainable. So why the story, Christian? Environmental, social, and governance, which is ESG. This investing type is really complex. It's also contentious, and it's also deeply personal. When you add in the complexities of ERISA and the fact that these funds need to be prudently selected, they need to be prudently monitored, and they need to be in the best interest of all employees, not just one employee or a subset of employees, this increases the inherent risk and factors to consider, especially those of you on the call who are fiduciaries. And all of this story leads us to why we wanted to host the webinar today. As you heard earlier, our speaker today is Courtney Lee from Dimensional Fund Advisors. Courtney and her team's funds were ultimately the options that we selected for this particular organization based on their alignment with the employees, that survey that we ran, and other factors that you'll learn this afternoon. Courtney's going to drill down deeper on the definition of ESG. She's going to teach us how to navigate the promises of ESG funds, and then share with us Dimensional's approach to incorporating ESG factors and the prudent process that they follow in their investment offering. I'll then wrap up today's call with a discussion around fiduciary factors to consider when you evaluate these fund types. I've also included a couple of resources that were very helpful to me and hopefully will be as advantageous and helpful to you and your committees as you evaluate these funds. And now, before I toss it over to Courtney, I said we were going to have a couple of polls. So the one that I'm going to launch now is asking what you hope to learn today. And as a response from this poll, we're going to try to tilt our communications to ensure that we're touching on all of your points. So let me go ahead and launch poll 2. Give you 60 seconds to respond. We have a couple listing here. Can we really make an impact? Courtney, we'll address that, right?
That's right.
Some folks, interestingly, 21% are worried about higher or lower returns. Generally, returns are the top dog when it comes to all types of investments. All right, a couple more votes outstanding here. We'll give you another 5 seconds and we'll finish out this poll. All right. Courtney, the Zoom floor is all yours.
All right. Thanks, Christian. And thanks to everybody who participated in the poll. It's really helpful for us to understand what's important to you. As Christian mentioned, as I introduced myself earlier, I'm Courtney Lee. I'm very excited to be here today to speak because personally, I'm very passionate about sustainability. And I agree with the science that climate change is going to have a very real impact on our way of life going forward. And the fact of the matter is that I'm not alone. And I suspect that's why many of you might be here today. There's no shortage of data documenting the growing popularity of ESG. For example, one of many stats you can look at is global sustainability now tops $30 trillion. And that's up 68% since 2014 and tenfold since 2004. So as interest in ESG rapidly increases, workers in different age demographics are demanding access to ESG options in their plans lineup. The most common supporters of ESG investments probably come as no surprise to you, are millennials and Gen Z employees. And as more members of Gen Z enter the workforce, demand for ESG investments will likely accelerate. In addition to that, many studies have found that incorporating ESG investments into retirement plans may lead to greater contribution rates, especially the parts of your participant base that are less likely to contribute, i.e. younger employees or women, for example. So today, we're going to start to equip you with the knowledge you need to evaluate ESG investment options and understand their role in a DC plan, starting with what is ESG. As Christian mentioned, what's clear is that ESG is a murky place with as much terminology as there are varying expectations. And to add to that confusion, there are a plethora of products that make a variety of claims. So we'll walk you through a framework of how to think about the various ESG investment options out there. I'll share where Dimensional fits in the ESG fund landscape and within that framework. And then, as Christian mentioned, he'll wrap up with what you as a fiduciary should be considering when you're evaluating these options. There are many different reasons why clients may be interested in ESG. They can believe that ESG can lead to outperformance. They may believe that we all have a duty to ESG, or they personally believe in ESG and want to make a difference in the world. So while ESG has become increasingly popular for these reasons, we've also identified in a study the areas that investors are concerned about. For example, we found that investors generally lack an understanding of sustainable investing. Sustainability is a broad subject covering many different topics that can be implemented a variety of different ways, like Christian touched on earlier. Others are concerned about transparency. Many approaches attempt to consider all or a large number of sustainability variables. And attempting to capture all or large number of sustainability variables reduces transparency and also may leave few investors satisfied given their primary concerns. Other investors are concerned about high expense ratios, for example. A lot of offerings can be very concentrated and relatively high cost. So we'll talk about Dimensional's approach to sustainability and how it addresses a lot of these concerns that you see up here on the screen. It's really not surprising that investors lack an understanding about what exactly ESG is. There's just a ton of jargon out there in the industry when it comes to ESG. Some of them are up here on the screen. All right. So as Christian mentioned, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And really, you can think of it as an umbrella term that incorporates all of these other terms that you see on the screen. We've been using the word sustainability and how we approach ESG. You'll also hear things about stewardship, responsible investing. You'll also hear terms like greenwashing, which is not on the screen, which refers to a company making people believe that it's doing more to protect the environment than it really is. So these companies will market their product or brand as green rather than do the hard work to make sure that what they're actually doing is sustainable. From your point of view, the same thing applies for investment products. Christian touched on going through a plethora of investment products that marketed themselves as green or social, but in reality, it was just a front for being able to garner flows or charge higher expenses.
And Courtney, the good news there is help is on the way. We were fortunate to spend some time with the deputy director of the SEC, and they're currently looking at launching some additional laws that will impact directly investment managers. So Dimensional will be incorporated in that as well, that if they use these terms like green or socially responsible, there needs to be some type of, I would say, investment process, which I know you'll walk us through Dimensionals here today, that is documented in their prospectus. And we could go talk on for the varying ways that they're going to evaluate. There's going to be three ways that they're going to do that. But I think that law will be very helpful for those on the call today. So when they see in a title of a fund that it says socially responsible, green, or sustainable, think of it as truth in marketing. So the SEC will require folks to actually be who they say they are.
That is exactly right. So we here at Dimensional we're very much looking forward to it, to some more clarity and helping investors understand where the different investment options lie, and to make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing. Another thing that's good news is that you don't have to understand all of the terminology on the screen to understand what we're doing within our sustainability portfolios at Dimensional. So part of the goal today is to simplify this and also put where we fall into context. When you break E, S, and G into their components, you get a very tidy acronym that's relatively straightforward. So if you think about environmental issues like emissions or hazardous waste, that falls fairly cleanly under E. Human rights issues like child labor or dangerous work conditions that I saw in the survey were important to that particular client's employee base. Those fall pretty cleanly under S. Governance issues like what a company is doing to act in the best interest of its shareholders, like having a board of directors that's well equipped to assess risk and hold management accountable, that all falls pretty cleanly under G. But there's quite a bit of overlap between them as well. So a company example that you might have seen a lot of in the headlines for various reasons is Tesla. They're a good example. Presumably the end product, its electric vehicle, is good for the environment. However, there are some social concerns like the questionable safety of the workers who mine the battery components. So is Tesla a good or bad company from an ESG perspective? I'd argue it's unclear. So while evaluating ESG issues can be a bit unclear, the acronym itself is, I believe, a great starting place to make some sense of all the jargon that you hear out there.
And Courtney, you made a good point earlier about the fact that it is deeply personal as well. So that's something that on a committee level, when you think about how complex this can get, our committees generally have 5 folks sitting across the table from us. And so you can have 5 different opinions on if Tesla falls into ESG or not.
Precisely. But I'm hoping that what we're about to walk through will help to provide you with at least a way of thinking through some of those issues, both from a personal standpoint and beliefs and expectations, as well as from an investment option standpoint. And as I mentioned before, I'll give you a sense as to where we specifically fit within the space, both in philosophy and in portfolio implementation. So there are various theories of what ESG investing is supposed to do. Some of those theories are about maximizing financial returns. Other theories are about achieving environmental, social, and governance goals with investors' investment dollars. Many investor expectations and theories fall into one or more of these broad categories that you see up on the screen. And as a result, ESG product development is born out of or being driven by investor demand. So you'll see you can generally map ESG investment options based on the promises they make to investors. While some investors, as you saw in the poll, assume that you have to give up returns to pursue ESG criteria, there are others who believe the opposite. So the theory for those folks who believe that ESG criteria can produce higher expected returns is that if you can find companies that have better sustainability practices, they should do better financially. And as a result of that, there are many investment managers who tout the ability to deliver higher expected returns by integrating ESG criteria as a very powerful marketing message. We're very research-based here at Dimensional, so we've done numerous studies and compiled them, the effects of ESG criteria on returns. And so far, we found that neither is the case. As of now, ESG has not been a driver of returns for better or for worse. And we think one reason for that is that a company's sustainability practices are public knowledge. It's not a secret. So market participants in aggregate are factoring this information into what they're willing to buy or sell a company's stock for. And I'll show you later that we have been able to achieve higher returns in our sustainability portfolios, not necessarily because of the ESG criteria specifically, but because we incorporate other considerations into our process. Another way investors think about ESG is from a risk management lens. So the thought process is, if you want to make money and you worry about the risk that environmental and social problems pose to the future cash flows of companies, you buy ESG funds that take those risks into account, and therefore you can buy companies that perform well in the long term. Said a little bit differently in less jargony terms, say you've got California-based plan participants. They may have concerns about the impact of wildfires on their ability to meet their financial goals in retirement. So they might prefer an ESG fund that has taken into account the impact that wildfires might have on, say, a property developer's profits, for example. So many investment managers tout that by evaluating a company based on ESG criteria, they can anticipate and avoid material ESG risks, and that will be good for returns. One thing to be aware of as a fiduciary is that there's currently no standardized way to score companies or investment options based on ESG criteria. Nevertheless, we can work with what we have, and ESG ratings do give us a lens to study ESG risks. Many of the ESG ratings that you'll see out there are designed and meant to evaluate how companies are managing material ESG risks. So MSCI is a remarkably well-respected and reputable data provider in the industry. This is a quote from their website explaining that their ESG ratings are designed to measure a company's resilience to long-term industry material ESG risks. But what we see in practice is that evaluating risks is not only incredibly difficult, but it's also different than assessing who the good guys are. If you think about the Tesla example I shared with you earlier. So lots of ESG rating agencies were caught out on Russia, for example. So here we can see MSCI's ESG ratings for the top 10 companies in Russia before they invaded Ukraine, compared to after Russia invaded Ukraine. So we see that MSCI's ESG rating of the top companies in Russia didn't change until after Russia's invasion. ESG ratings implicitly promised to reduce your exposure to things like implication and human rights violations. But in reality, they're very reactive. Now, ESG ratings are useful, and they will continue to improve as the data availability and quality improve. So this isn't meant to deride them. The takeaway here is to be mindful that they aren't the end all be all. And as fiduciaries, you shouldn't be overly prescriptive when using them to make decisions.
Just to add to the confusion, right, Courtney?
Right.
What's the measuring stick?
Exactly. And hopefully that will continue to improve, but I want to give you a realistic view and help you to think critically about what you're consuming. There are others that say returns don't matter, risks don't matter, real world impact is what matters. And that was something that came up in the poll as well. We won't spend a ton of time here, and the reason is realistically, this is outside of the purview of DC plans, but I want you to be aware because you may hear this from plan participants, right? You may hear plan participants express a desire to make the world better with their investments. Oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes this looks like divestment. Bill Gates has an excellent quote that divestment to date has had zero impact to emissions overall. And this is because while hopeful in theory, in reality, divestment does not affect change. Once you're no longer a shareholder, you don't have a vote and you don't have a voice anymore. So what does Dimensional think would make a real world impact? A couple things like incentivizing consumer behavior, innovation, regulation. Those are things that really move the needle in terms of real world impact, and your investments should complement that. For example, I mentioned at the top of the call, I'm really passionate about sustainability. I want nothing more than to impact the world through my investments. But personal action, like I use rain barrels to water my plants, or my boss has solar panels and donates the excess energy that his family doesn't consume back to the Texas power grid, which we all know Texas Power Group could use as much help as it can get. That's how you make a real impact. I see Christian's got something to add here.
Yeah, no, and really, what I was thinking of is from a fiduciary perspective. This really is where you have to evaluate the options that are available, because you can either go and look at the companies and organizations, as Courtney said, that are already doing a great job, or she used a word that's huge, and it's something that we believe here at Greenspring is innovation, right? Human ingenuity. That's what drives growth of our economy and our country and us as a people from a global perspective. And what if that innovation comes from a company that's not very sustainable today, and you cut them out of investments, and now they don't have access to resources to invent the next best thing? And so again, the word that Courtney used, and I'm exacerbating it now, I think, is murky, right? And so I always look at it and ask the question, well, do you want to be part of the problem, or do you want to be part of the solution? And by part of the problem is by not investing or divesting, to use Courtney's terms, there's no real action occurring. And then do you want to cut the folks out that could be the new innovative company or have the next best idea to change the world? So again, very murky, but again, available to us as fiduciaries to select and put in a plan so we can, again, drive our values to the best or to the extent that we can.
Precisely. So far we've talked about how ESG doesn't result in higher returns. Not necessarily. It's a bit unclear through the research right now. We've talked a lot about risk and how it's kind of tough to be able to predict that. We've talked about real world impact and how that can be achieved through various means and using your investment portfolio as a complement to that. It is, however, very sensible and realistic to have my investment portfolio aligned with my values, for example. So we think values alignment is really the best use case for investors to include ESG funds in their investment allocation. And I'll walk through why that is, and then share with you how Dimensional fits within this particular promise. Before I head that way, Christian, anything to add here?
No, I think we're in good order. And I will just make one comment. For those of you who have questions, please use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to ensure that we get all your questions answered. A lot of you said you were just curious, so this is a perfect place. We have the expert on the line with Courtney to help address your curiosity. So do not forget the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen.
Precisely. Thank you. So I'm going to state the obvious here. Values are important to people. And as Christian pointed out earlier in the call, everyone has different values, but this is not up for debate. So values that people have impact the companies that we buy from, where we choose to work. On this poll, on this survey, consumers said that they are 80% more likely to buy from a company that stands up for environmental issues. I personally stopped buying clothes from fast fashion brands like H&M and ASOS because of their extensive environmental damage and worker exploitation. Those companies are not aligned with my values. Employees say that they're 40 or 84% more likely to work for a company that stands up for environmental issues. So values in the end can impact careers, they impact the friends that we choose, and even the advisor that we choose. So I'll say it again, that it's not only sensible, but it's also attainable and realistic for investors to align their values with their investment portfolio. But you do need to be very thoughtful in your approach. And this is what Christian was touching on earlier. And this is ultimately where Dimensional fits into this framework and into the ESG investment landscape.
And Courtney, if you don't mind, we have a great question that just came in. It said, does a company's philanthropic or corporate giving in ESG areas come into play?
In terms of, if you think about impact on their society and impact on the communities of which they're a part of, yes, those their philanthropic giving absolutely makes a difference in terms of the lives of the communities that they operate in. What we don't see is it making a difference in terms of their profits or reducing risk. So a lot of the ways in which we engage with companies, so we do over 600 engagements a year. with companies is making sure that their management and their board of directors are well equipped and are quantifying risks that pose threats to their business. So a lot of things matter. It just is a matter of where exactly it matters or what effect it's having. But we're not seeing it directly tied to returns.
And Courtney, I think if I could take a little bit of a different approach to this question, and the person who asked it, hopefully forgive me for taking some artistic license here and coloring outside the lines of it. But let's just say, using an example, that this is an oil company, but the oil company takes a portion of their profits, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10%, whatever that may be, and they donated it to research on renewable energy. Is that factored in to their overall ESG score, where perhaps as a company, they have high carbon footprint, things of that nature, they're not working in clean fuel, but they are making a substantial impact with their corporate profits. Is that factored into your ESG scores?
That is not factored into our ESG scores specifically. There are lots of different ways that people score companies on ESG, but I will say, to your point, Christian, that's why we don't exclude entire sectors from our portfolios. So in this example, energy is, and we'll talk about Dimensional's approach here in a moment, but energy is one of the high carbon emitters, right? But that doesn't mean that we exclude all of energy from our sustainability portfolios. What we do is we reward the companies that are investing in green energy in the future, and then we underweight companies that are doing less of that work. So even if it's not reflected explicitly in an ESG score, it is being considered in terms of how we have thoughtfully designed our portfolios.
Great question and great answer. Thanks, Courtney.
Yeah, of course. So nearly 15 years ago, we launched our sustainability portfolios with this idea that investors who choose to align their investments with their values shouldn't have to make that choice at the expense of sound investment principles. So our process is, as I mentioned at the top of the call, research-driven. We leverage data and we leverage the scientific community to identify the environmental issues that pose the greatest threat to sustaining life on Earth. And what we've found is that scientists all agree that the Earth is warming. And this is due primarily to greenhouse gas emissions that humans are responsible for. So as a result of this research and the data that's available to us in order to implement effectively, our sustainability solutions are designed to target a meaningful reduction in exposure to greenhouse gas emissions and potential emissions from reserves. Oftentimes that means reduction in fossil fuel, for example. So said another way, we strive to have a meaningful reduction to exposure to both what's in the air for greenhouse gas emissions and also what's in the ground, because fossil fuels in the ground enable future greenhouse gas emissions, if that makes sense. So when an investor wants a values-aligned investment, we want to make sure that they understand what the objective is. And we want to make sure that they have a way to measure if we are delivering what we said we're going to deliver. And as I mentioned, our objective is very targeted. It's to reduce exposure to greenhouse gas emissions and potential emissions from reserves. We also provide very transparent reporting every quarter so that investors can easily assess if we are delivering what we set out to accomplish. So what you're seeing here is relative to our benchmark, our US sustainability strategy delivered an 80% reduction in exposure to greenhouse gas emissions and 100% reduction in exposure to potential emissions from reserves. It's really important here to note that as an investment manager, we can't physically go out and remove emissions from the atmosphere. But what we can do is design our portfolios to reduce exposure to companies that have the highest emissions and increase exposure to companies that produce lower emissions. Now, I've been very careful. I think our industry is full of too much jargon. So I've been trying to make it more approachable and accessible to people. But I also recognize that most people, including myself, we don't think in carbon dioxide equivalents, which is what the previous screen is a measurement of. So I've included an example here to make this more relatable. So say you were to invest $1 million in the US sustainability strategy. That's a lot of money, but it's also an even number. That reduction in exposure is relative to its benchmark. And that would be the equivalent of 5,165 gallons of gasoline consumed, for example. Now, again, that doesn't mean that by investing in this fund, you're taking out, you're preventing the consumption of 5,165 gallons of gas, but it's illustrative of the reduction in exposure that you have by investing in a strategy that targets that type of exposure reduction.
So Courtney, what you don't know about me is I'm a car guy. And so that last one is really impactful with the miles, right? So basically you're telling me I can drive across the country. Gosh, what would that be? 35 times before. So that's a really impactful illustration. It really brings things home for me personally.
Good, good. I hope it resonates with other people. Now, Christian touched on this as well, but here is the proof behind it. We are able to deliver an outcome that's meaningful, as I showed you, and align with investor values, while also being low cost. Our sustainability strategies on the left-hand side, those are the average expense ratios versus peers for all the categories that we have a strategy. Our sustainability strategies have some of the lowest expense ratios in the industry. But at the same time, if you look over to the right, we're able to maintain broad diversification and broader diversification than most of the industry. So Christian touched on why this was important earlier. So it's important because pursuing sustainability in a concentrated portfolio can lead to higher risk and less reliable outcomes for investors, versus pursuing sustainability in a broadly diversified portfolio reduces risk and helps to increase returns because you're able to reliably capture those drivers of return.
And Courtney, what I would say, and what I found in the research that we did here at Greenspring, was there wasn't really a good in the middle option. It was either heavily screened, and to the tune of, the S&P 500 becomes 30 investments. Or it was so broad that it wasn't necessarily making an impact. So one of the reasons that we've enjoyed having these portfolios in our clients' plans is the fact that it really does give you a best of both world approach when it comes to exposure as well as diversification. Tied into, notwithstanding values.
Precisely. So we've talked about the meaningful reduction in exposure to emissions. We've talked about it being low cost. We've talked about it being broadly diversified. What about returns? So what we're showing here is that investors can have their cake and eat it too, to a certain extent. This graph shows the performance of our U.S. Sustainability Core 1 portfolio versus its non-sustainable counterpart, the U.S. Core 1 portfolio. And you can see the strategy has delivered a comparable return experience since the Sustainability Fund was launched in 2008. What's not shown on this screen is the benchmark's performance. And so I'll just verbally share that with you here. You can see that over this time period, the U.S. Sustainability Core 1 portfolio returned 9.88% since its inception. The non-sustainability sister fund, the U.S. Core 1 equity portfolio, returned 9.81% since common inception, so similar returns. The Russell 3000, which is the benchmark for both of these strategies, returned 9.73% over this time period. So both strategies outperform the Russell 3000 because of the considerations that we incorporate in our investment process. And despite the sustainability overlay of the Sustainability Fund, we're able to deliver similar results as the non-sustainability strategy. So to conclude, we offer a targeted approach that investors can understand. We offer transparent reporting, higher expected returns than the benchmark, low costs, and broad diversification. These are all things that plan sponsors care about when choosing an investment option. And as Christian pointed out, that's one of the reasons why he ended up going with us. In terms of the promises that we touched on, I do want to revisit these before I pass it off to Christian. We can't promise ESG will increase your returns or lower your risk. Although we can use governance, as I mentioned before, to encourage good oversight of risks. We can absolutely help people invest in line with their values. But as I mentioned before, you do need to be thoughtful in your approach. And if lots of people feel the same way about the same issues, it does have the potential to have an impact. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that have come through. Otherwise, I will pass it off to Christian to cover the fiduciary considerations to when evaluating ESG funds.
Courtney, we got a couple of really good questions, but just
Great.
given the time, how we're coming up on the top of the hour here with about 13 minutes left, I do want to hit on the fiduciary considerations, and then
Great.
hopefully we'll have enough time to circle back on the questions that we've received. I will broadly say, though, again, with that in mind, we have about 5 minutes that I'd like to cover left. So if you do have a question, we would love to have it now. If you could go ahead and enter it in the Q&A. So from a fiduciary consideration perspective, I'm really looking at from a plan sponsor and a committee level, right? Those who have the authority or discretion over the retirement plans, investments, and the operation of such. I think a lot of times it's really easy to forget or possibly gloss over the fact that being a fiduciary, that liability actually pierces the corporate veil, meaning that you are personally liable for the decisions that you make. Not to scare anyone on the call, I'm sure you're aware of that liability, but it just drives home the importance. So the Department of Labor essentially calls being a fiduciary in the qualified plan retirement space the highest responsibility known to man, which I think is a pretty big way of describing what your responsibilities are in a role like that. So I have listed here, first and foremost, you have a duty of loyalty. And what that duty of loyalty does is it's not just what you feel as a committee member, which is one of the things that we tried to align in the case study that we gave earlier. It's about your employees. So you have a duty of loyalty to your employees, and not just them, but the beneficiaries that depend on them. So that's their families as well. So using that as a starting point and understanding your true role and responsibility, it's really important that you define ESG because in absence of a definition, even the best advisor of the world is going to really struggle helping. So if you can work with your advisor or Greenspring to help understand what that definition is to you and your employees, it'll make finding the right investments that much easier. There is a duty of prudence. And so what we mean by that is we are tasked as plan fiduciaries to run prudent and repeatable processes and be able to determine why we made the decisions that we did. The next bullet there I have is document. So it's often said, and we've often been quoted with our committees in saying, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. So having the duty of loyalty to your employees, documenting and defining what ESG is to you, the process you went through to evaluate those funds is the appropriate way to evaluate and look at them, and also document them in the entire process, and then continue to review and monitor ongoing. So those are some huge considerations and really actionable items that you as fiduciaries can take. But we won't leave you with no resources. There are a couple that I used extensively in my research. And also still utilize in conjunction with some of the organizations rather that we use these ESG portfolios. So when there's a good article that I either catch in one of these resources or the CFOs, we send them back and forth. So the first and foremost in defining and really pulling questions to ask, I would leverage the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. It is the USSIF. It's got a tremendous website, and a lot of fund companies have really sponsored. So in the landscape that is quite undefined, the USSIF has really done a great job of pushing for clear definitions. And again, there's a lot of fund companies that you would recommend, or you would recognize rather, who have jumped on the bandwagon. So it's a great place to start. And also when you're evaluating the individual funds, there's a great investment analyzer. It's called fossilfreefunds.org. I've used it multiple times myself, and it goes very in depth to the measures that matter to you. So you can filter. Courtney used the example of not buying H&M clothes anymore because of the labor. You can actually screen funds based on the consideration of labor itself. So a very useful tool there. And then a great one from an informational perspective and from an individual company perspective is an organization called As You Sow. Their website is listed there as well. You can really deep dive into the practices of a particular organization to understand how they're operated. If you are currently a fiduciary to a plan and you have access to a record keeper or a particular fund company, you can actually request their view of ESG, their governance reports, and you can read through them. I've done that for a host of investment firms for clients. And it's really interesting and eye-opening, their approaches. And sometimes it's very comforting because they are taking into deep consideration these values. So those are, again, some great resources. Again, what we have listed here, and reaching out to the investment providers that you're currently using and requesting their ESG documents for their specific organization. So with that said, we've got about 8 minutes left and quite a few questions. Again, promoting the Q&A, we have a tremendous resource here in Courtney. As you can tell, she's very knowledgeable and passionate about this subject. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box. So one of the ones that I thought would be great to bring up is, are the decisions surrounding ESG ratings to either include or exclude ESG funds, for Dimensional specifically, are those audited externally? Are those audited by an external company?
They're not. So the way that it works, and this is part of what I was talking about with there not being as much standardization in the industry, the way that it works here at Dimensional is that we purchase various data from data providers. So I think we have 8 data providers, and we use that information to generate an ESG score for every company in our investment universe. So it's around 14,000 companies. And we use that ESG score that we've generated from external data, but we generate the score internally. We use that to rank from the best to worst based on our ESG criteria. And then we use that as an input to our process to either overweight or underweight or completely exclude a company.
So that was a little bit more, I would call it micro and Dimensional's approach. Could you provide some insights on us on a macro level, or essentially saying, hey, where is the fund management industry in general at when it comes to including or applying these metrics, being more definitive in what the definition actually is, their processes, any due diligence or oversight? Could you give us some insights there?
Yeah, so there are, from a high level, sorry, I tend to go micro because I'm an equity strategist. So I live in the weeds. So thank you for pulling me back up, Christian. From an industry standpoint, there are various ESG rating agencies out there who have different inputs that go into their scores. So there are a lot of resources. My advice to you as a fiduciary or someone who's evaluating these resources is to compare and contrast. You know, try to find, there's Morningstar that provides resources, MSCI, FTSE Russell, Sustainalytics is another company that doesn't have skin in the game that provides these types of analytics. So if you look across them, and that's what we do internally, and identify similarities and then also the inconsistencies, it'll help to build a more complete picture of how these things are actually rated.
Thank you for the update. So everyone, we appreciate you, the brave folks who have made it to the end of this call. Hopefully you received what you were looking for when you joined us. We do have one additional poll question, which we're going to launch right now. And is, would you like to have a further conversation around ESG for your organization? And if so, we would love to reach out to you and schedule some time to connect. And we can also loop in Courtney and the team from Dimensional as well. Awesome. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much. Courtney, if you could, because we do have and are managed by compliance, could you please show our disclosure slide? Awesome. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Just again, to circle back on our housekeeping, we will be sending those of you who have the SHRM designation, the CE credit, and a recording will go out to everyone who is on this afternoon's call. Just give us about 5 business days or so to do that. Thank you very much, Courtney, for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us here on the line today. It's very evident. And thank you to the Dimensional team for putting together a very thoughtful and methodical process that aligns with our fiduciary practices as retirement plan sponsors and fiduciary advisors because it is prudent and repeatable. And again, thank you.